It sure is nice here in the park.
It sure is.
You said you had a story to tell me, man.
Have you ever heard of Venden, the parable teller?
I don't think so. Not that I can recall.
I was just reading one the other day. It had a beautiful lesson in it.
I have been anticipating, man. Go ahead and tell me.
In Morris Venden's book, Modern Parables, he has this story. He calls it in the chapter in the book, the plot of ground, but for some reason I keep wanting to call it the gardener. And it's based on John 15:8. It says, "Herein is my Father glorified, that you bear much fruit. So shall you be my disciples." This story is about a plot of ground that wanted to be a garden. The story actually begins with a farmer who purchased a plot of ground at great expense. He then provided some seed of excellent quality and came to the plot of ground and sowed the seed. Well, the plot of ground rejoiced. It had always wanted to be a garden, and it began immediately to try to do its part toward becoming a garden of beauty and fruitfulness. It began to look at itself and discovered to its dismay that it was covered with a number of unsightly weeds. There were thorns and thistles and briars and brambles. The plot of ground was concerned and ashamed. Before the coming of the farmer, it hadn't paid much attention to such things, and the weeds had made terrible inroads. Their roots were deeply entrenched in the soil. How can I receive any benefit from the seed when all these weeds are growing unchecked? Wondered the plot of ground. Everybody knows that a garden must be weeded in order for the seed to grow. So it began immediately efforts to try to remove the weeds. It wanted to cooperate with the farmer so that the time would come as quickly as possible when it would no longer be just an ugly weed patch, but would become a lovely garden. The plot of ground struggled and fretted. It really wanted to get rid of the weeds, but the problem was figuring out how. All the instructions about weed pulling seemed to be vague and contradictory. The plot of ground heard from one source that if it would get rid of the leaves and stems, the farmer would then be willing to pull out the roots. But it discovered that it was too weak to get rid of the leaves and stems. It was told that if a plot of ground did its part, the farmer would do his part. But the plot of ground seemed unable to do any part of the weed pulling for itself. It was often told to try hard to overcome the weeds, but it didn't exactly know how to do that either. And when the weeds were still apparent week after week, those around the plot of ground and even the plot of ground itself began to wonder if it were really sincere in wanting to get rid of the weeds. Someone suggested to the plot of ground that if it would not try to remove the weeds from the whole garden all at once, but concentrate on just removing one weed at a time, that would be easier. But the plot of ground found itself unable to remove even one weed. At times, the plot of ground would almost give up in discouragement at the lack of progress being made. But then it would once again picture the garden it longed to become, and it would again put forth earnest efforts to try to get rid of the weeds. But all of the efforts the plot of ground made to rid itself of the thorns and thistles and briars ended in nothing. One day, the plot of ground was forced to admit that it would never become a beautiful garden on its own. And on that day, that very day, the farmer came to the plot of ground with some terrific news. The farmer had come often before, but the plot of ground had been so busy struggling with the weeds that it hadn't really taken time to listen. The farmer told the plot of ground something that was almost impossible to believe. It seemed at first glance to go contrary to everything the plot of ground had ever heard about gardening. Here is what the farmer said. It is not the responsibility of the garden to get rid of the weeds. Its own weeds, that is the work of the gardener. It is the gardener who pulls the weeds. Well, you can see right away why the plot of ground had a hard time with that one. Who ever heard of a gardener who was willing to pull the weeds from the garden, from his own garden, or from the garden he had given himself for? Who ever heard of a plot of ground that wasn't expected to first rid itself of its own weeds before a gardener would be willing to come and work there? No wonder the plot of ground had trouble with the farmer's announcement. But it was either that or give up all hope of becoming a garden. So the plot of ground surrendered to the farmer and allowed him to pull the weeds. And the first thing you know, the weeds were being pulled, and by the roots too. Not just the leaves and stems went, but the whole plant was uprooted and taken far away from the plot of ground. And the garden began to grow and develop. As time passed, the plot of ground, now a beautiful garden, continued to allow the gardener to do his work. And the garden continued to do its work. It continued to accept the seed that the gardener sowed, drank deeply of the water the gardener showered, and basked in the sunshine that the gardener provided. The plants in the garden grew and brought forth fruit, some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. My friend, I'm just sharing.
Thanks a lot.